Heart
Heart
transplant waiting
transplant
lists
waiting
reach
lists
record
reach
high,
record high,
with doubling
with
in
doubling
number
in number
waiting.
waiting.
Heart
Heart
transplant
transplant
waiting
waiting
lists are
lists
at a
are at
record
a record
high,
high,
with the
with the
numbers
numbers
waiting more than
waiting more than
doubling in a
doubling in a
decade.
decade.
Experts said the
Experts said
number
the
of
number of
hearts
heart
donations is
donations is
failing to
failing
keep
to
pace
keep
with growing
pace with
demand
growing
and
demand
advances
and
in medicine
advances
which
in
are keeping
medicine,
some
which are
patients on
keeping
the
some
lists for
patients on the
longer.
list for longer.
The annual
The annual
figures show
figures show
295
295
patients
patients
waiting,
waiting,
up from
up from
126 in
126 in
2010,
2010,
with an
with
average
an
wait of
average
3
wait of
years to
3 years to
transplant.
transplant.
More than
More than
200 people
200
have
people have
died in the
died in
last
the
5
last
years
5
while
years
waiting for
while
such
waiting for such
operations.
operations.
Ministers today
Minister
pleaded
today
for more
pleaded for more
families to
families to
discuss
discuss
donations
donations
ahead of
ahead of
changes to
changes
law
to
on
law
organ
on organ
donation,
donation,
which will take place
which
next
will
year.
take place next
From
year.
next year,
From next
England and
year,
Scotland
England
will
and
move
Scotland
to a
will move
system
to a
of
system of
opt-out donation,
out
with
donation,
consent
which consent
presumed unless
presumed
people
unless
record a decision
people
not to
record a
donate.
decision not to donate.
John Maingay,
John Mangay,
Director of
director
Policy
of
at the British
policy at the
Heart
British
Foundation,
Heart
said,
Foundation, said
"Hundreds of
hundreds
people
of people
across the
across the
country are
country
on
are
the
on the
waiting list
waiting
for a
list
heart
for heart
transplant at
transplant
any one
at any
time.
one
And
time.
sadly,
And sadly,
not
not
everyone will
everyone
receive
will
the
receive the
transplant that they
transplant that
desperately
they
need.
desperately
The
need.
introduction
The
of the law
introduction
in
of the law
England
in
and
England and
Scotland
Scotland
means
means
we will
we
switch
will
to a
switch to
soft
a soft
opt-out system,
opt-out
which
system,
will provide
opt-out,
much hope
opt
for those on the heart
those on heart
transplant waiting
transplant
list.
waiting list.
Lindsay Fitzpatrick,
Nancy Fitzpatrick,
34,
34,
from the World,
from the world,
will have
will
been
have
waiting
been
for
waiting
3
for three
years on
years on
Saturday.
Saturday.
She
She
said,
said,
"I have
I
had
have had
health
health
problems my whole
problems my
life.
whole life.
Throughout my
Throughout
life,
my
I have
life, I
struggled
have
with my
struggled with
mobility,
my mobility,
breathlessness, and
breathlessness, and
exhaustion on a
exhaustion
daily
on a
basis.
daily basis.
I have
I
to use
have
a
to use a
wheelchair or
wheelchair
mobility
or
scooter
mobility
when I'm out
scooter
and
when I'm
about.
out and
I know
about.
it is
I
hard
know
for
it is
people to
hard for
talk
people
about
to
organ
talk about
donation,
organ
but
donation,
for people
but
like
people
me
like me
and many
and many
others that are
others are
waiting for a
waiting
heart,
for heart,
that
that a
conversation could
conversation could
save our
save our
lives,"
lives,
she said.
she said. Heart transplant. I know it is hard for people to talk about organ donation, but for people like me and many others, they are waiting for a heart. That conversation could save our lives, she said. Out and about, 去户外活动. I feel quite relaxed when I'm out and about. 去户外活动. Scooter, 电动代步车. A light motorcycle, usually with small wheels and a curved metal cover at the front to protect the rider's legs. Nowadays, riding a scooter is becoming a new fashion. Exhaustion, 精疲力竭, the state of being very tired. Her face was gray with exhaustion. Breathlessness.不能呼吸的. He arrived breathless at the top of stairs. Mobile. An electric wheelchair has given her greater mobility. 行走的能力 mobility. The ability to move or travel around easily. Struggle with. I'm struggling with my test. With learning English. Lindsay Fitzpatrick, 34, from the war, will have been waiting for 3 years. On Saturday, we'll have been waiting for 3 years on Saturday, she said. I have had health problems my whole life. I have had health problems. My whole life. Throughout my life, I have struggled with my mobility, breathlessness, and exhaustion on a daily basis. I have to use a wheelchair or mobility scooter when I'm out and about. The introduction of the law in England and Scotland means we will switch to a soft opt-out system, which will provide much hope for those on the heart transplant waiting list, 句子的主语是 introduction， 谓语是 means， 后接宾语从句 We will switch to a soft opt-out system， 最后是非限定性定语从句，说明引入这项法律这件事将为等待心脏移植的病人带来很大希望。Switch 转变改变 To change or make something change from one thing to another. We are in the process of switching over to a new system of invoicing. Desperately 绝望的 Desperately 绝望的 Desperately in a very desperate way. The doctors tried desperately to save her life. John Maggie, doctor of policy at the British Heart Foundation, said hundreds of people across the country are on the waiting list for a heart transplant at any one time, and sadly not everyone will receive the transplant that they desperately need. The introduction of the law in England and Scotland means we will switch to a soft opt-out system, which will provide much hope for those on the heart transplant waiting list. Presume 假设假定 to suppose that something is true although you do not have actual proof. They are very expensive, I presume. Consent 准许同意 consent to do something. Consent 有准许允许这样的意思，同意 consent presume. Her parents finally consented their marriage. He is charged with taking a car without the owner's consent. Consent 同意准许 The permission to do something especially given by somebody in authority. He is charged with taking a car without the owner's consent. Consent 有允许、准许这样的 agree 更强调同级之间的不存在允许、准许这样的意思。Consent default 默认 What happens or appears if you do not make any other choice or change? Default theory. The only way of avoiding these things, he felt, was to opt out of mainstream society, was to opt out of mainstream society, opt out. I'm optimistic about my future. Opt out. From next year, England and Scotland will move to a system of opt-out donation with consent presumed, unless people record a decision not to donate. Ministers today plead for more families to discuss donations ahead of changes to law on organ donations, which will take place next year. 句子的主干是 Ministers plead for more families to discuss donations ahead of changes to law on organ donations. 是副词，短语表示时间，最后定语从句 which will take place next year 做进一步限定，说明这项修改的法律开始的时间。Organ, a part of the body that has a particular purpose, such as the heart of the brain, part of a plant with a particular purpose. The organ transplant is not a mission impossible in medical field. Ahead of us lay 10 days of intensive training. Ahead of us lay 10 days of intensive training. Ahead of us lay 10 days of intensive training. Plead 呼吁声援 Ahead of plead 呼吁声援 Plead for somebody to do something. The United Nations has pleaded for a halt to the bombing. Ministers today pleaded for more families to discuss donations ahead of changes to law or organ donations which will take place next year. Ministers today pleaded for more families to discuss donations ahead of changes to law on organ donation, which will take place next year. Will I need to have an operation? Will I need to have an operation? Operation figure 身材人 The leading figure 领先人物 figure she has a nice figure. The process of cutting open a part of a person's body in order to remove or repair a damaged part. Will I need to have an operation? The annual figure showed 295 patients waiting, up from 126 in 2010, with an average wait of 3 years to transplant. More than 200 people have died in the last 5 years while waiting for such operations. Advance 进步 Advance of technology, advance of education. Keep pace 保持崎岖并驾齐驱保持同步 Our production can't keep pace with the orders coming in. Donation, something that is given to a person or an organization, such as a charity, in order to help them. The act of giving something in this way. Thank you for your generous donation. Thank you for your generous donation. Generous donation. Heart transplant waiting lists are at a record high, with the numbers waiting more than doubling in a decade. Heart transplant waiting lists are at a record high, with the numbers waiting more than doubling in a decade. Experts said the number of heart donations is failing to keep pace with growing demand, and advances in medicine which are keeping some patients on the list for longer. Reached record high, reached record low. The temperature reached record high yesterday at 40 degrees. Transplant 器官等的移植 移植栽种 a medical operation in which a damaged organ is replaced with one from another person. Now heart transplant is possible. Heart transplant waiting list reached record high, with doubling in number waiting. Heart transplant waiting lists are at a record high, with the numbers waiting more than doubling in a decade. Heart transplant. Ministers plead for more families to discuss donations ahead of changes to law on organ donations. That will provide much hope for those on the heart transplant waiting list.
Heart transplant waiting lists reach record high, with doubling in number waiting. Heart transplant waiting lists are at a record high, with the numbers waiting more than doubling in a decade. Experts said the number of heart donations is failing to keep pace with growing demand and advances in medicine which are keeping some patients on the lists for longer. The annual figures show 295 patients waiting, up from 126 in 2010, with an average wait of 3 years to transplant. More than 200 people have died in the last 5 years while waiting for such operations. Ministers today pleaded for more families to discuss donations ahead of changes to law on organ donation, which will take place next year. From next year, England and Scotland will move to a system of opt-out donation, with consent presumed unless people record a decision not to donate. John Maingay, Director of Policy at the British Heart Foundation, said, "Hundreds of people across the country are on the waiting list for a heart transplant at any one time, and sadly, not everyone will receive the transplant that they desperately need. The introduction of the law in England and Scotland means we will switch to a soft opt-out system, which will provide much hope for those on the heart transplant waiting list." Lindsay Fitzpatrick, 34, from the Whirl, will have been waiting for 3 years on Saturday. She said, "I have had health problems my whole life. Throughout my life, I have struggled with my mobility, breathlessness, and exhaustion on a daily basis. I have to use a wheelchair or mobility scooter when I'm out and about. I know it is hard for people to talk about organ donation, but for people like me and many others that are waiting for a heart, that conversation could save our lives," she said. Heart transplant waiting lists reach record high, with doubling in number waiting. Heart transplant waiting lists are at a record high, with the numbers waiting more than doubling in a decade. Experts said the number of heart donations is failing to keep pace with growing demand and advances in medicine which are keeping some patients on the lists for longer. The annual figures show 295 patients waiting, up from 126 in 2010, with an average wait of 3 years to transplant. More than 200 people have died in the last 5 years while waiting for such operations. Ministers today pleaded for more families to discuss donations ahead of changes to law on organ donation, which will take place next year. From next year, England and Scotland will move to a system of opt-out donation, with consent presumed unless people record a decision not to donate. John Maingay, Director of Policy at the British Heart Foundation, said, "Hundreds of people across the country are on the waiting list for a heart transplant at any one time, and sadly, not everyone will receive the transplant that they desperately need. The introduction of the law in England and Scotland means we will switch to a soft opt-out system, which will provide much hope for those on the heart transplant waiting list." Lindsay Fitzpatrick, 34, from the Whirl, will have been waiting for 3 years on Saturday. She said, "I have had health problems my whole life. Throughout my life, I have struggled with my mobility, breathlessness, and exhaustion on a daily basis. I have to use a wheelchair or mobility scooter when I'm out and about. I know it is hard for people to talk about organ donation, but for people like me and many others that are waiting for a heart, that conversation could save our lives," she said. Heart transplant waiting lists reach record high, with doubling in number waiting. Heart transplant waiting lists are at a record high, with the numbers waiting more than doubling in a decade. Experts said the number of heart donations is failing to keep pace with growing demand and advances in medicine which are keeping some patients on the lists for longer. The annual figures show 295 patients waiting, up from 126 in 2010, with an average wait of 3 years to transplant. More than 200 people have died in the last 5 years while waiting for such operations. Ministers today pleaded for more families to discuss donations ahead of changes to law on organ donation, which will take place next year. From next year, England and Scotland will move to a system of opt-out donation, with consent presumed unless people record a decision not to donate. John Maingay, Director of Policy at the British Heart Foundation, said, "Hundreds of people across the country are on the waiting list for a heart transplant at any one time, and sadly, not everyone will receive the transplant that they desperately need." The introduction of the law in England and Scotland means we will switch to a soft opt-out system, which will provide much hope for those on the heart transplant waiting list. Lindsay Fitzpatrick, 34, from the World, will have been waiting for 3 years on Saturday. She said, "I have had health problems my whole life. Throughout my life, I have struggled with my mobility, breathlessness, and exhaustion on a daily basis. I have to use a wheelchair or mobility scooter when I'm out and about. I know it is hard for people to talk about organ donation, but for people like me and many others that are waiting for a heart, that conversation could save our lives," she said. Heart transplant waiting lists reach record high, with doubling in number waiting. Heart transplant waiting lists are at a record high, with the numbers waiting more than doubling in a decade. Experts said the number of heart donations is failing to keep pace with growing demand and advances in medicine which are keeping some patients on the lists for longer. The annual figures show 295 patients waiting, up from 126 in 2010, with an average wait of 3 years to transplant. More than 200 people have died in the last 5 years while waiting for such operations. Ministers today pleaded for more families to discuss donations ahead of changes to law on organ donation, which will take place next year. From next year, England and Scotland will move to a system of opt-out donation, with consent presumed unless people record a decision not to donate. John Maingay, Director of Policy at the British Heart Foundation, said, "Hundreds of people across the country are on the waiting list for a heart transplant at any one time, and sadly, not everyone will receive the transplant that they desperately need." The introduction of the law in England and Scotland means we will switch to a soft opt-out system, which will provide much hope for those on the heart transplant waiting list. Lindsay Fitzpatrick, 34, from the World, will have been waiting for 3 years on Saturday. She said, "I have had health problems my whole life. Throughout my life, I have struggled with my mobility, breathlessness, and exhaustion on a daily basis. I have to use a wheelchair or mobility scooter when I'm out and about. I know it is hard for people to talk about organ donation, but for people like me and many others that are waiting for a heart, that conversation could save our lives," she said.
Opt-out.
Heart transplant waiting lists reach record high, with doubling in number waiting. Heart transplant waiting lists are at a record high, with the numbers waiting more than doubling in a decade. Experts said the number of heart donations is failing to keep pace with growing demand and advances in medicine, which are keeping some patients on the lists for longer. The annual figures show 295 patients waiting, up from 126 in 2010, with an average wait of 3 years to transplant. More than 200 people have died in the last 5 years while waiting for such operations. Ministers today pleaded for more families to discuss donations ahead of changes to law on organ donation, which will take place next year. From next year, England and Scotland will move to a system of opt-out donation, with consent presumed unless people record a decision not to donate. John Maingay, Director of Policy at the British Heart Foundation, said, "Hundreds of people across the country are on the waiting list for a heart transplant at any one time, and sadly, not everyone will receive the transplant that they desperately need. The introduction of the law in England and Scotland means we will switch to a soft opt-out system, which will provide much hope for those on the heart transplant waiting list." Lindsay Fitzpatrick, 34, from The World, will have been waiting for 3 years on Saturday. She said, "I have had health problems my whole life. Throughout my life, I have struggled with my mobility, breathlessness, and exhaustion on a daily basis. I have to use a wheelchair or mobility scooter when I'm out and about. I know it is hard for people to talk about organ donation, but for people like me and many others that are waiting for a heart, that conversation could save our lives," she said.